Hey everyone, Chris Kuszmaul here on what I expect for your open-ended question. I expect in your open-ended question that you're going to be asked to create a field in one of your objects. I'm expecting you to have to cope with a collection of objects of that type. I'm expecting you to have to write a method that iterates through that collection of objects and processes each item based on that new field. Okay? And if you're able to do that, each one of those things that I just described, then you're going to get an excellent score on your open-ended question. So let's look at an example that is built from the example that is given in the test, but it's generalized a little bit. So it might be a little bit hard to follow because it will seem a little abstract in that generality. Suppose you have a collection of items that have one characteristic. Add another, okay? Add another characteristic to your items. Now what? So there's your very general open-ended question. Well, here we have the first line of code that I would write. I would just sort of sit down and say, okay, look, what would my item array look like? What would my collection look like if I were to create a single example that incorporated the new change? And so the two arguments here to this, the two elements of this new array, of this array called item array, are one which invokes a constructor which doesn't necessarily exist when we've been given it, that adds the characteristic that our items have a name, and the name for this item is Jane. And over here I have the old use. Okay, we'll assume that this is something that's already been provided. But if I can write a line of code like this, or if I want to be even more esoteric, write English that describes this line of code, then I'm in a great position to then do the detective work to identify the sequence of things that have to be done. Well, guess what? If I have a constructor that has an extra argument, if I'm invoking a constructor with an extra argument, then I darn well need to implement it, right? And so if we go over to item, the class item, that means that I have to have a constructor that takes those two arguments here. Okay. Now it's worth noting that we were in this example we're adding a field that is the name. So you might have chosen to create a setter which sets the field rather than having a constructor. That's worth knowing about. It's worth saying. You can say in English, I'm not sure whether I should make a setter that establishes, that sets the field after I've constructed it, or to create a new constructor. Even if you're completely off, okay, this is important. Even if you're completely failing to address a specific question, you are showing that you understand that there's a distinction and a value to a mutator, which is what a setter is, and a constructor. And understanding that these are options in the process of adding the information will be valuable. Now, I'm not, so be careful not to just automatically write a constructor and a setter no matter what the context. But if you're able to put a description in that talks about this distinction, then you're going to be literally making points. You're going to be scoring points, okay? Now, let's go back to me. When we have this item array, we might also conceivably have, and they have in their problem, a larger scale processor for a collection of items of some kind. And so I kind of made a generalization of a class called an item processor that takes an array of items. So at some point in your code, somewhere on the test, they're almost certainly going to require you to take a collection as an argument into a constructor and transform and move that into another collection that's locally stored, probably an array list, no guarantees, but that seems most likely. And so you'll want to make sure that you do these key things. Can you say in English why we have this line here? This makes it so that we've actually allocated a space for the array list. Otherwise, items is going to be null, and we're going to get null pointer exceptions when we try to add items to it. And of course, we have to add these items to it. We can't just do an equivalence between the references because that'll cause the argument to be potentially modifiable. So we'll talk about this some more in the next video as well.